Welcome to Podforest, where forest pros discuss forest woes. Our goal is to communicate with private landowners on a variety of forest health issues to support management and stewardship of your lands. In this podcast, we'll be discussing important topics in forest health with experts in multiple fields. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy this episode of the Proforest Podforest. All right, welcome back, everybody. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ken Raffa, emeritus professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For those of you who are interested in entomology, you've probably heard of Dr. Raffa. Very famous, very influential guy. And we are so honored and so stoked to have him here joining us from apparently very lovely Wisconsin right now. It's quite warm in Florida today that we're recording this. Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Ken, we've had a variety of topics covered. We've talked about invasive species, talked a little bit about climate change, fire, AI. We're kind of all over the place. I'm really excited to have you on here because we're talking about tree resistance. And I think that's a pretty critical part when we're talking about forest health and resilience is, okay, well, how are trees resistant to some of these threats? So I was hoping just to kind of get us up to speed, what would you say, exactly is tree resistance and what role does it play in forest health?
Well, in its simplest sense, resistance is the ability of a tree to keep from being eaten, to defend itself. And it's easy to think of plants as these very passive entities and to envision the forest as one giant salad bar for insects, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Trees have lots of defenses. They're badasses, and they do not hesitate to unleash these defenses against anything that attacks them.
I love what you said about trees being badasses in their defense. I don't think a lot of people think about that. I think
They
people
are.
just, like you said, just trees and plants just being very passive about these things. What are some pretty cool or noteworthy examples that seem to really stick out to you in terms of tree resistance?
I think what's cool about it is tree defenses are multifaceted. They don't rely on just one thing and they're integrated. So usually the first line of defense are physical barriers, just things like tough leaves and tough bark that keeps insects from being able to attack their tissues. And that screens out most of them. But then when insects do get past that, then the plant releases all sorts of resins and gums that can, bind them up and entomb them. You think of, Baltic amber that was famous of Jurassic Park as the example. And then some of these physical defenses get even more sophisticated. Plants have trichomes, which are tiny, sharp hairs that actually impale the insect, and they die a pretty ugly death on those things. They often have lots of silicone in it. And what silicon does to the insect is it actually grinds the mandibles down while the insect is feeding it. And so eventually the poor caterpillar doesn't have any mouth parts left and they can't reproduce them. And so the insect just starves to death. And then if that isn't enough, a lot of times the plant will actually just drop the part the insect is feeding on. And so if you think of like a leaf miner, for example, feeding in a little serpentine pattern in a leaf, the leaf might decide, to hell with you, I'm just dropping that whole leaf off. And then the insect is stranded on the ground to be eaten by ants and ground beetles and whatever else is there. And then they also have chemical defenses. And these chemical defenses poison the insect and they attack the insect's nervous system. They attack its digestive system so that it binds up nutrients so that no matter how much the insect may be eating, it eventually starves to death anyway. And these chemicals are pretty broad acting. So they don't just kill the adult insects. After it kills the adults, it goes after their families. It eats their eggs, it eats their, kills their larvae, it kills just about everything. And then they also have ecological defenses, basically alliances. And so some trees produce structures that house ants, and they produce sugars for these ants to keep them around. And then these ants will attack any insect that comes on the tree, any spore that lands on it, any mammal that starts to feed on it. And they're not afraid of anything. I mean, in the tropics, these ants will even defend trees against elephants. I mean, they just hate everything. And then also with ecological defenses, a lot of times plants will produce chemicals that attract the predators and the parasites of the insect that's trying to feed on it and lure in the insect's enemies. And they also harbor bacteria and fungi that produce all sorts of wild toxins that the insect probably hasn't been exposed to. And so it's this whole combination of defenses that plants use. Plants hold a lot in reserve, and they have induced defenses that are only turned on once something starts to feed on them. And so during these induced defenses, they start producing more of these compounds and also entirely new compounds. So the poor insect went through all the trouble of trying to identify exactly which plant has the right chemical so they could feed on. But then its very act of feeding causes the plant to completely change those things. And then while that's going on, the plant even starts killing some of its own tissue, and that's called a hypersensitive response. And now the insect is stranded in these lesions that are of no nutritional quality whatsoever. And sometimes we call this a scorched earth defense. And it's nicknamed after what Russia did to Napoleon when he invaded them. And then also years later when Germany invaded them, where the Russians, as they retreated, wiped out everything, their own farms and everything. Well, humans did not invent the scorched earth strategy. Plants invented it millions of years before humans ever thought to employ it. So overall, if you're an insect trying to feed on plants, feeding on plants is a tough way to make a living.
Ken, that was a super interesting, very detailed. I didn't know anything about the scorched earth strategy, actually.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with trichomes and some of these other defenses. Scorched earth is particularly interesting to me. And all the while you were talking about this, I was thinking of I'm interested in pollinators, and I was thinking about the sort of co-evolutionary arms race of monarch butterflies and milkweed plants. Monarchs have to get more and more resistant to the toxins, and then the milkweed has to become more and more toxic or have more trichomes. All that being said, despite the, as you said, badassery of the tree resistance here, outbreaks still happen. And at that point, it seems the resistance that trees can use are, I don't want to say useless, but they don't seem to necessarily curb the tide. Is that true?
Well, for every adaptation the tree has, the insect has a counter adaptation. And so sometimes it'll be very direct, just detoxification. Insects have enzymes that can break down those toxins. In some cases, like in the monarch caterpillar or even in sawflies feeding on pine trees, the insect actually sequesters those defensive compounds and then stores them. And then that provides a line of defense against the insect's predators. And so it's really turned the tables on the plant. And in some cases, the insect will sever the leaf veins or the resin ducts. And by doing that, and it's a behavior called trenching, they dig this little trench in the leaf, and then that keeps all those induced chemicals from reaching where the insect happens to be feeding on. Insects also have alliances. They carry fungi and bacteria that can break down those defenses and be very efficient at it. And in the case of bark beetles, they engage in cooperative behavior. And so, what bark beetles manage to do is they take those defensive chemicals, in this case, they're called terpenes, and they oxidize those terpenes into aggregation pheromones. And so, as long as the tree is fighting back, that's actually bringing in more and more and more bark beetles. And so they collectively exhaust the resistance of the tree. And so here the beetles are actually using the plant's own defense against it. It's kind of an early version of jujitsu. So humans didn't invent jujitsu either. Beetles did it a long time ago. And so when you get into these outbreaks, the tree's defenses may not be important in these particular cases. In other cases, like leaf-feeding insects, tree defenses are continually important because now the insect has already used up the better trees, if you will, and now it has to kind of wander over to the trees that the previous generation tried to stay away from. And so you get this progressive effect of resistance on the insect population. So it really varies from system to system. And if you're a forest manager, what you want to do is tilt the playing field in this very precarious balance, tilt it in favor of the tree.
And so how would a landowner or land manager sort of tilt the table, so to speak, or tilt it towards the tree's favor in this case?
One way is diversification. If you have a diversity of tree species, tree ages, how you're managing them, tree genotypes, anything that diversifies the forest makes it harder on the insect because insects don't feed on plants. They feed on certain species of plants. And even that's not true. They feed on certain parts of certain species of plants and certain age groups. And so each generation of insects has to go out and find that particular resource. And in a diversified forest, that's a hard thing to do. In a monoculture, on the other hand, it's as easy as pie. Every tree you encounter meets your requirements, and it's much easier to have an outbreak. So another thing a land manager can do is to manipulate the environment that work against what the insect is doing. And in the case of bark beetles, for example, which many people are concerned about, anything that enhances the overall vigor of the tree will enhance its defenses. If the trees are well spaced, if they're young, if you're suppressing weeds, any of those things are going to help. Now, with different kinds of insects, that's not going to be true. Some insects actually thrive better on healthy plants. So,
Hmm.
for example, some of the sap feeding insects, the more hydrated the plant is, the better it is for them to feed on. And some of the shoot feeding insects, for example, do better on fast growing trees than slow growing trees. So, in those kind of systems, you might want to be a little cautious about over fertilizing or over irrigating. And then for some kind of insects, it really doesn't seem to matter. For the leaf feeding insects, we don't see much of a relationship between the stress on the tree and how susceptible it is. It tends to be more genetics, but even there's a relationship between the stress on the tree and how tolerant it is of defoliation. So you don't want to just enhance resistance, you also want to enhance tolerance, how well the tree can handle a particular amount of defoliation.
So when we're thinking about tree resistance, it seems like there's a combination of both environmental factors and also genetics that might influence how
Yeah,
resistant a tree might be.
exactly.
So in a system that's particularly stressed, maybe it's getting hit by severe hurricanes regularly or catastrophic wildfires, that could have a major impact on tree resistance in a detrimental sense.
Yeah, and especially things like drought. You get a sudden uniformity of stressed trees over a large landscape. And then that can allow bark beetle populations to build up. And then once their populations have risen, then because of their cooperative behavior, they can overcome the defenses of almost any tree out there. So it's all about keeping them from passing that threshold. When bark beetle populations are low, they better not go into a healthy tree because the healthy tree is going to kill them. And so they have to find very stressed trees. But there's only so many stressed trees out there. There's only so many suppressed and diseased, et cetera. So it's very limited. And then those stress trees aren't just available to the tree killing bark beetle, they're available to a lot of other insects too. And so now they have to compete for that resource. And the tree killing bark beetles tend to be very poor competitors. And also, those stress trees tend to be a fairly lousy thing to eat because they're stressed, they're slow growing, and they're not very nutritious. And so, most of the time, the bark beetles are kept in that precarious situation where their reproductive gains are pretty much offset by their losses. And they'll
Hmm.
stay in that kind of situations for decades. But then if they can pass that threshold, then at that point, tree defenses, which were critical in whether or not an outbreak started, become inconsequential in bringing about the end of that outbreak.
So the defenses can become overwhelmed once
They
that
can be
threshold's passed.
overwhelmed in the case of certain species of bark beetle, like mountain pine beetle
Hmm.
would be an example of that. Southern pine beetle would be an example like that. And in a lot of the other bark beetles, not so much. They tend to be more associated with stress trees,
Hmm.
regardless of how high populations there are. And wildfire, I should say, tends to not lead to outbreaks because with a wildfire, you have some trees that are so damaged, they're a very poor resource, and the only insects that can get in there are really, I'm going to call them scavengers.
Hmm.
And then the trees that have not been affected, they're still healthy and not a good resource for the bark beetles. So there tends to be a pretty narrow Goldilocks zone for the tree killing bark beetles. And you get kind of a resource pulse where the beetles then exploit that resource, but then it's used up and they can't move on from there. So normally you need some kind of more region-wide stress to prevent that transition from happening.
And things like severe weather, drought, those would fall into
Yeah.
that sort of category.
Yeah. For example, if you have a heat wave,
Mm.
then the reproduction of the beetles increases. You get more winter survival, and that's particularly important in the mountainous regions of the West. You get more generations per year, which would be really important for something like southern pine beetle. And then that can raise the population to the point where all of a sudden now they start attacking the healthy trees and doing it successfully.
So I've come to I'm not a formally trained entomologist, but I've come to understand that there's thousands and thousands of bark beetle species, but only a handful and some change are considered really pests. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say, the overwhelming majority of them can only colonize dead trees and
Hmm.
dead tissues. And then there's maybe about, I'm going to say 25 species that, when conditions are right, attack and kill healthy trees, maybe a little more than that. And then there's maybe about 10 worldwide that undergo that behavior where there's positive feedback and this self-amplifying kind of behavior that the higher the population, the more trees they can kill, the better trees they can kill, the more they can reproduce in them, the more they leave the competitors behind, get freed of that. There's probably about 10 of those worldwide.
I gotcha. So if an outbreak occurs, some might say when an outbreak occurs, what are some of those best practices that people tend to employ to try and quell an outbreak?
You know, once that outbreak has started, options are really limited. And you might want to think in terms of sanitation and recovering your resource. And that gets controversial because it gets into
Hmm.
human values. Some
Sure.
people despise sanitation and removing a lot of trees, and others would say it's a necessary tactic to basically deprive the insect of the food it needs in order to keep reproducing. And so it all really depends on what is it you value about that particular forest. I'm always asked, what should I do about bark beetles? And my question is, well, what do you want from this forest? Do you want it for wood production? If that's what you want, here's a particular prescription. If you want it for wilderness to let nature be as nature is, then in that case, do nothing. Now, you might be a little bit put off that nature can be a lot more rowdy than what you had in mind, and it's killing a lot of trees. But again, it comes down to your objectives. And here's where forestry gets complicated. If you look at a potato field, different people might differ on how that potato field should be managed. Some might prefer insecticides, some might prefer biological control, some might prefer genetic resistance, but there's no arguing about what a potato field is for. That's not true of a forest. When somebody looks at a forest, some people see a livelihood. a way of providing for our needs for shelter. Other people might see recreation, a place to hunt or fish or go backpacking or bird watching. Other people might see ecological services like carbon sequestration and hydrological quality and biodiversity. And so I think whenever we're talking about managing insects, we have to first decide what is it we value about this particular piece of land. And then with that in mind, employ what seems to be useful accordingly. Now, in some cases, we can have our cake and eat it too. I mean, people have gotten pretty good about improving biodiversity in pine plantations, for example. And so we sometimes can have it multiple ways, but eventually in forest management, we have to recognize that we have various value systems and they do come into conflict. I mean, one of the things I really love about insects is they do have a way of forcing us to make decisions that we would rather keep avoiding. They are really good at that. And so humans are good at deferring decisions and kicking things down the road. And
Hmm.
insects have a great way of saying, okay, what is it you want? Lay it on the table. Let's have at it.
I love your comparison of the potato field. Anytime I'm teaching about ecosystem services, I typically use a similar example of saying, what do you see in a forest? But I've
Hmm.
never really hit that point home of, if you look at a potato field, there's no real, there's pretty good consensus on what that's used for. I'm gonna have to take that from you, Ken, but I'll give you due
The
credit.
other thing is because of the way our political system works, we tend to change our approaches to forest management every 2 years or 4 years with elections. So transfer that to a potato field. That would be as if that farmer changed his objectives for what that piece of land was for every 2 weeks. That's kind of what we tend to do in the way we manage our forests politically.
So on the different sort of strategies, I think things get particularly complicated if they weren't already. It kind of makes me think of dealing with invasive species because pests and native pests, non-native pests, whatever, and just invasive species don't really care about private property boundaries. So if landowner A is not necessarily doing sanitation, so to speak, that outbreak could spread into the neighboring property, which fuels the outbreak and causes all sorts of other complications between landowners and how we manage our lands and all that kind of stuff. So, on that sort of note, are there ways that we can support tree resistance? Because obviously there are these environmental factors, droughts, severe weather. We can't exactly control that, so to speak, right? But what can we do to support tree resistance?
Well, let me start with the invasive species issue. The problem with an invasive species is the tree has not been exposed to that in the past. And so it's not going to be equipped with the right defenses. And it might not even recognize that it's being attacked until it's too late. And in the case of induced defenses, that rapid response is really important. And so this new pest, whether it's an insect or a fungus, has the advantage of stealth. And in a way, it doesn't matter how good your defenses are. If you don't detect it in time, you're behind the eight ball. And of course, there are tragic human examples to this where a new pathogen came into a population, such as when Native Americans were exposed to the smallpox virus. It's not that they didn't have good immune systems, it's just that they had not co-evolved with this particular virus. And so we get something like emerald ash borer get into the country, and almost all of our ash trees are highly susceptible to it. But in China, where this insect came from, emerald ash borer doesn't attack live trees. It attacks trees that have been knocked over by the wind, hit by lightning. It wouldn't dare go into a live tree because the tree would kill it. And we've had the reverse of this too. There's an insect, red turpentine beetle, we have. It's not a particularly damaging bark beetle. It's a little bit of a nuisance, if you will. But that actually got into China. And there in China, it's been killing millions of trees. What we can try to do is reverse that. It's not easy. One is by breeding for resistance. And there's different approaches of this. There's selective breeding, where you try to find that rare individual that might happen to be resistant. There are hybridization. There are molecular assisted approaches. And there's also transgenic resistance, where you're actually taking a gene out of one organism and putting it into a completely unrelated organism. Now, with trees, breeding for resistance is a lot more difficult than in agriculture because of the time frame. And that's historically been a very big challenge. There are
Mm-hmm.
some molecular assisted approaches now that are accelerating that. And then beyond that, there's the challenge. Well, then how do you disseminate it? How do you put this out there? And so the most successful examples of resistance have been with planted trees in the urban sector, for example, or in commercial plantings. And so there are some varieties of elm trees that are resistant to Dutch elm disease, for example. On the other hand, trying to alter native ecosystems, that's a really difficult thing to do. And so I think the most promising opportunities right now are with commercial plantings and things of that nature. The other thing we're seeing kind of analogous to invasive species is where insects are expanding their range due to climate change. And so, for example, in the Rocky Mountains, we see some strong elevational gradients of trees. And in the lower elevations, you have lodgepole pine, which has been the primary food source for mountain pine beetle for eons. And over the years, they've had this kind of cat and mouse game we've talked about. But then when you go into the higher elevations, you have white bark pine. And historically, there have occasionally been warm spells where it was warm enough for mountain pine beetle to get into those high elevations, kill some trees, knock around for a year, and then it would get cold again and the insect would have to retreat. But now we're seeing year after year where it's warm enough for the beetles to be in those high elevation stands. And if you look at the defenses of those trees, they're not very good because their major line of defense historically has been cold weather. And so the tree allocated its resources into other types of physiologies, such as cold resistance. And they historically allocated very little to defense. And so that's kind of an analogous situation to invasive species.
So one of the main takeaways I'm getting from this is that our response proactively and even reactively needs to just be as multifaceted as the various defense mechanisms that trees use against these outbreaks.
Exactly, exactly. And this is why I think it's worthwhile to go back to something I had said earlier. If you study tree insect interactions, you come away with a strong impression that feeding on trees is a tough way to make a living. Start with that and keep tilting the playing field as much as you can in favor of the plant.
Well, Ken, I think that's a great spot to wrap up. Ken, thank you so much for being with us. I think our listeners got a lot of great information. I certainly learned quite a bit. If anything else, people should take away that trees are badass. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you on the next one.
Thanks for tuning in. For more information, head on over to the Proforest website at proforesthealth.org. For any questions you may have, or to stay updated on all things Proforest, check out our social media at ProforestUF on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Episode hosted by Dr. Tyler Carney. This podcast was edited by Ben Ginkars Davies. The Proforest Podforest is brought to you by Proforest, Proactive Forest Health and Resilience at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.